Hello, I'm Ed Reed. I'm an editor at Energy Voice. I'd like to invite you, queuing over there at lunch, to come join us once you've got a plate. Come join us to learn about transportation of hydrogen and some of the challenges that we might see going forwards. So I'm joined by an esteemed panel, Olivier Mussat from ATOME, Lazarovitch from Bracewell, Steffan Eldred from Innovate UK. And we're here to look at some of the opportunities around some of the targets that we've been set out, particularly in the European Union. So the EU said it's aiming to import 10 million tons per year of low carbon hydrogen from 2030, which is an ambitious target. I think it's fair to say. I'm gonna drill into my panelists' feelings about that a bit more closely as we go along. But to get there, there's clearly a market opportunity. So there's a number of countries that have been looking to try and work out how to exploit this advantage, this opportunity. Namibia, Egypt, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, all keen to try and provide some of that low carbon hydrogen into the EU. And people are really taking this seriously. The IEA put out a report this week on Oman, saying the country could export 1 million tons in 2030, which would be a nice contribution to the EU's targets if they can meet it, and then rising to 8.5 million tons per year by 2050. Big numbers if they can make it happen. How feasible are these plans? I'm going to stop talking at this point and bring in my much more learned colleagues. Olivier, I'm going to start with you. The EU wants to import that 10 million tons of hydrogen by 2030. What does it need to achieve this goal?
I think the reality is, let's remember, number one, why do they need to import that much? It's because domestically you cannot produce as much as they would like to. Grid capacity isn't there, there's not enough land, you name it. So the reality is what we are seeing, and as a project developer, we will be exporting ammonia as well. It's really enabling the market, having clarities. Clearly, the US IRA has massively accelerated everybody. I still remember 2 years ago being in a meeting with some EU advisors, being incredibly proud of having put together a 25 billion euro package for hydrogen, and that package was incredibly restrictive, incredibly Eurocrat-centric, and suddenly the US comes in and say, hey, nearly $1 trillion, well technically 800 billion and change, to do the next LNG, and we will be selling subsidized ammonia hydrogen into Europe. So from my point of view, at least from a European point of view, what they need to focus is really promoting the import side. The way that the UK has created the CFDs, they're trying to do the same now for ammonia. But we have to have also realistic views of life, right? Germany has a target of about $700 a ton for green ammonia import. I mean, we are seeing the numbers on the engineering side. This is tight, right? Really, really tight. You may have seen NEOM project in Saudi. They achieved final investment decision, $8.5 billion. It's less than a quarter profit for Saudi Aramco, so that's easy enough. And clearly quite aggressive targets. But let's not forget the engineering principles. We've never had a green ammonia project bigger than 20 megawatt. We've never had electrolyzers in operation for more than 100 megawatt. We're talking about gigawatts that we can deliver in 3 years' time. Debatable. That's just the production side. Now let's talk about the import side. And yes, we have plenty of import facilities all around Europe for ammonia, for fertilizer and industry. How are we going to crack it back to hydrogen? Where's the market? That's the big question. Me as a producer, where is the market? That's what we have to figure out too.
And Ro, I'm going to bring you in. What are your thoughts about that 10 million ton target? What steps should the EU be taking at this point?
Well, I mean, I completely agree with Olivier here. I think the road the EU has decided to take is a road of encouraging the private market to invest in this in this type of product. Now, in order to accelerate the development of this market, and there've been a lot of, I think, apt comparisons to the LNG market. The EU is trying to achieve in 10 years what took the LNG market maybe 30 plus years to achieve without this type of acceleration. I think the EU, to a large extent, is doing the right type of things. It is trying to clarify the standards for what constitutes, RFNBOs, for example. Recently we got a bit more clarity about that. In the next couple of months, hopefully there's a tick on that so that everyone knows, yes, these are the standards and we can start implementing them. And there are a few initiatives out there. H2 Global is one of them. The European Hydrogen Bank is another, that are trying to put money behind all of this. The question for me is if you're really trying to get all the market in on this, if you're trying to get the producers in, if you're trying to get the demand side on this is are they moving fast enough with the clarifications, and are they putting enough money behind these investments to support them? And for me, that's a big question, right? There is a lot of movement. It's very positive. I think it's amazing to me to see the EU moving as fast as it has, but I'm not sure it's moving fast enough or putting enough money behind this to achieve these 2030 goals.
And Steffan, what are your thoughts? I mean, clearly, looking at those targets, there are some challenges that Olivier and Roa brought up. What do you think?
Yeah, so I guess I tend to think of things at a very practical level. So I'm looking at those targets and I'm seeing the ships landing in the European ports, the UK ports, and just racking my brains. I think there's almost more questions than the number as to what happens with that. So how does it come across? Probably ammonia. Do we have the infrastructure to deal with the ammonia? Actually, does some heavy industry want to, rather than targeting hydrogen as a fuel, do they want to go straight to ammonia? So I just think there's a lot of steps to go to upgrade the infrastructure to actually be able to do something with it. When you first raise the question, it sounds really simple. You create a trade deal and you you buy the hydrogen, right, or the ammonia. But yeah, how you actually deal with that when it arrives is a different story.
I suppose on that note, I mean, I think we've clearly seen a lot of sort of high-level European interest. I think Ursula von der Leyen was in Namibia celebrating the recent project there. I mean, do you think that there should be so much of a focus on hydrogen at this point? I mean, looking at the challenges, looking at the needs to kind of create that, to tackle those engineering problems along the way. As you said, ammonia. Steffan, I'm going to stick with you. Do you think that there should be that 2030 target, or should we be looking at other things? HVDC cables, for instance, more domestic generation.
So I think we need it all, okay? So often there's this sort of feeling that hydrogen's competing, and we're competing with other energy vectors, but whichever country we're talking about, net zero decarbonisation targets are incredibly tight, incredibly tricky. As Rose said, we're trying to do things in a handful of years that have taken 20, 30, 40, 50 years to do before. So I suppose what I'm saying is I don't think we can afford not to be thinking about hydrogen and including hydrogen in that way, but that doesn't mean it's at the expense of everything else. Trouble is, it all comes at a cost. So the simple answer is we kind of need it all, but there's a lot of challenges with hydrogen, but some people talk about renewables as though it's a done deal, but what we do when curtailing wind power and things like that is just as much of a challenge. So yeah, the answer is I think yes, we do need hydrogen. Yes, we should have those 2030 targets, but as complementary to everything else. Yeah.
And Rob, with the same kind of question, I mean, just looking about obviously there are decisions made, right? Every time you choose something, you're not choosing something else. Should the EU maybe be thinking about closer to home projects? Say, as HVDC from North Africa, for instance, is one area that we've seen some interest of late.
I mean, I'm going to be boring and agree with what was said before me, because the reality is that this energy transition is a long transition, and two, there is no one solution. I think it is interesting to look at hydrogen specifically, because I think the most interesting thing about hydrogen is that it can be used to decarbonize most things if we really want to. But it's probably not the most economic way to decarbonize everything. There are more efficient ways of doing it. And if there's one thing that we've learned about energy consumer behavior from the recent invasion to Ukraine and the impact that's had on energy prices, is that consumers are very sensitive to pricing, and there is a limit to what they're willing to pay. So we have to make sure that this energy transition uses fuels in a way that both helps decarbonize the economy, but also preserve value to end consumers, right? Make sure that they are paying the least amount possible for the energy that they're buying while making it green. And to my mind, hydrogen is not the solution for all of that. It'll be relevant to part of the economy. The easiest part of it, for example, is refining processes and fertilizer plants where there is no real substitution to hydrogen. And today that is quite a big pollutant. And there are plenty of other industries in which it's also relevant. But as a universal fuel, probably not. It's extremely expensive.
Olivier, you're working on some projects looking at things like green fertilizer. What sort of lessons do you think that the EU might be able to take from your experience?
I think the first lesson for us, it was always it's a question of first principles. There is the market of today, the market of tomorrow. And we are trying to do everything at the same time. And whether it's the EU, whether it's the UK, whether it's the US, you cannot work on both the demand and the supply at the same time. Pick your battle. Right? And what we are very clear in what we are doing is the biggest use for hydrogen today, I should just say, it's ammonia. The biggest use for ammonia is fertilizer. So use that sector to go and prime the pump so that then you have enough hydrogen to then make it very easily for everybody to say, hey, I will switch to a hydrogen. If you talk to the ship or ammonia, you talk to the shipping sector. There's only a couple of shipping companies who are now moving to ammonia, but as fuel for their ships. But the biggest barrier to entry for them is the availability of supply of such fuel. Right, diesel, you can get diesel everywhere. We've had a lot of noise around methanol because it has a lot of similarities with handling of diesel as far as quantity, range. The reality is it is a lot harder to produce methanol than it is to produce ammonia. So you have, again, picking your battles. Do you want to work on the market side? Do you want to work on the demand, on the supply side? And our view was, well, we know we have a price problem for hydrogen. We know also that it's not just about energy security, it's about food security. I mean, this thing over here says hydrogen for life. It's not just about energy, guys, right? It's food, right? And energy is expensive, you have a change in government. Food is expensive, you have a bloody revolution. And let's not forget that. So you have to, again, figure out where you want to go, and unfortunately, a lot of the dialogue, whether it's in the EU or elsewhere, has been moved more towards the energy sector, because that is the one where, let's say, even civil society was very vocal about carbon emissions. Right? And talking about price without talking about carbon is also not useful. So we are realizing slowly but surely that we are working in a very big ecosystem. Let's start with the low-hanging fruits, which is agri is the lowest hanging fruit, and then you work from there. And you are seeing in Europe now, they are realizing that maybe the energy bit is not the way you start. You start with steel, right? And then you work from there, because otherwise, you're going to be overanalyzing and looking for perfection. And you mentioned a project earlier, which there are projects today which are going round and round and round because they are looking for that 99.9%. And investors have exactly the same problem. We've been talking to many investors, and they think, oh, this is just like another solar and wind project. I'm going to have fixed price contract, fixed offtake. It's easy, it's de-risk. Like, no, we are creating new markets, and you have to accept risk. And we've seen announcements from government saying, oh, $500 billion towards this, $200 billion towards that. Guess what? You go to the credit committees, say, oh, that sounds risky. Where is your market? Where is your tech? So there's announcement, and then there's the reality on the ground. So biggest advice is stick to one thing, deliver that one step, then move to the next step.
And so it sounds like a part of the problem, or possibly a major part of the problem, is around the price for hydrogen. Ro, what are your thoughts about kind of creating that kind of market mechanism? You brought up the idea of LNG, and obviously that pricing of LNG has been a sort of a long-running question, and how that evolves. Do you think that there's a way to shortcut that process in terms of sort of securing hydrogen imports?
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting question. So I think if you look at the development of the LNG sector, it basically built itself around long-term, usually 20-year plus supply contracts, right, offtake. And you could take that contract and then you could project finance your project on the back of it, build it, supply it, great, everyone's happy, and it works. Now, when we come to the hydrogen economy, I think there are a lot of similarities in terms of how the industry might be built. And you need that long-term certainty of offtake and pricing in order to fund this, right? No one wants to fund all of these projects off of equity. You want some project financing in there. You want some bank debt. You want other debt into these projects. So you need to provide that long-term certainty. I think so far it's been very difficult to find that in the market. You know, the H2 Global initiative in particular, I think has been fantastic. I think it's a great example of you know, in this case the German government stepping in and saying, you know what, I'm going to be a market maker here, right? I believe they're planning on signing up to 10-year contracts with certainty of pricing, and they're basically going to take the risk on selling that to users in Europe on sort of short-term basis, on 1-year sales basis, and cover the gap on that. And to an extent that is great, because I definitely think if you want to accelerate the development of the market, this is the type of thing you should be doing, and everyone's looking very closely at what the Hydrogen Bank is going to be doing. But for me, the question around this, and we've looked at these contracts a little bit, is one, you know, the 800 million that they've started with is probably not enough. So how quickly are you ramping that up, right? And two, how do market participants really feel about all the other terms of the contract, which, you know, in some cases can be quite onerous. And maybe, I don't know if you've looked at these contracts or these type of offtake agreements, but I would be interested in your view as a market participant on how you see those contracts.
The reality is, I mean, what you see is it has this contract, right, is happening outside of the EU. Right? Germany had to step in and say, hey, I need to think about my own policies and my own security. And indeed, from a numbers point of view, 800 million is roughly 12 years of supply from our first phase in Paraguay. So, and it's 120 megawatt. You know, we're talking about 10 gigawatt, guys. Right? So that's kind of a harsh reality. And I go back to the fact that everybody expects it's going to be like the LNG industry, where JERA from Japan stepped in with 20-year contracts. In the ammonia world, you cannot have a hedge. You cannot hedge for more than 2 years. Because it's chemical, it's fertilizer, that's the nature of that market. So clearly government has to find a way to step in, but step in smartly. And for us, many times, it's not about the amount of money, it's the simplicity of a process. If I have a process which is going to take me 2 years from beginning to end, and it's with zero clarity, as an investor, I'm not going to go in. I'm not going to take the chance. And guess what? You may have seen, what was it, 200 megawatt project in Holland with Shell, which got EU support. According to the rules of that particular support, they should have never qualified for it, but they managed to, let's say, push the right buttons of the EU. So that's, again, clarity of rules is absolutely important, and simplicity, not getting into a 2, 3, 4, 5 year process, or very quickly you go back to what we discussed or what we heard earlier, where we have ambitions in the UK, but you will not have access to the grid before 2037. Okay.
And Steffan, I'm going to bring you in to give some of that UK perspective. Obviously, the UK's got its own hydrogen production plans. Do you think any of that might go to exports? I think that there have been a couple of possibilities brought up. I mean, presumably we're fairly close. Maybe a pipeline into Europe. What do you think?
It sounds like a great idea if we've got enough and we've got spare capacity. From what I see through things like the smaller scale low carbon hydrogen standard projects for net zero hydrogen fund, that type of thing. I'm not sure how much we will have to spare. I think the demand is there. The demand is real. We're asked every day, where can I get demand projects that have demand for it are struggling to access hydrogen, and in particular, clean hydrogen, let's say. So, yeah, it would be nice to have. I like the idea of it. I like the idea of the UK profiting from it. But I think it could be quite a long way off before we're able to produce more than we can use. Yeah.
So I mean, that sounds like there's clearly demand for it. I think there is corporate demand to decarbonise. There are clearly projects around the world looking at these opportunities. So it really just feels like a case of market failure, doesn't it? Where we just have not got to the point where those contracts are seen as bankable. Is that the right way to look at it?
Yeah. So I think it's there is definitely the demand. The problem is at the scale that existing producers need, the demand is perhaps already taken up by existing mechanisms, fertiliser, ammonia, what have you. The people that at Innovate UK, the people that are coming to us a lot are much smaller scale SMEs that are starting out on this journey. So they need hydrogen, and they need it now to continue to grow. They need the assurity that it will be there and they'll be able to access it and their customers can access it. But as in terms of the market, perhaps they're not requesting the quantities required to stop the market failing, I guess. Yeah.
So, right, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add to that. I think the word you used, market failure, is very interesting, because I don't think there is a market failure here, right? I think when you have a new market developing, that takes time. And if you let the market do it at its own pace, we wouldn't be where we are with hydrogen at the moment, right? It takes time for you to kind of figure out which industries are more willing to pay for your product, what's the most efficient way to do it, how to ship it, how to get it around. And it's an iterative process, which we're trying to accelerate here. And part of the challenge is that as we're going ahead, we are noticing all these issues around, what industries are best to use it in, right? Is it the industries that are most interested in it, and most willing to have a conversation, or is it the industries that the governments are telling us they want us to invest in? Are the rules catching up with where we need to be? I was asked a question by someone not too long ago that was, if I produce green hydrogen in the UK, but my molecules come directly from North Africa, am I eligible for these particular grants? And we looked at the regs, and the answer was, we don't know, because they're not clear enough. They clearly haven't thought about this type of scenario and are completely internally inconsistent on this point. And you're also looking at a whole lot of different market players going into this market. Some are very big players who can afford to make speculative investments, and others are investors who are looking at short-term returns. And we were advising one client on a government framework agreement that they eventually backed out of, because the commitments, the upfront financial commitments that the government was asking for, were too high for them, given their return horizon, right? They basically were willing to invest this much, but we can't go that high up unless we know exactly where our return is coming from. And that's a challenge in this market, I think.
And so I suppose just sort of looking at that way in which to sort of maybe kind of tie up demand in the way that you sort of talking about that sort of SME challenge, it feels like sort of industrial clusters are the way to go with that, where you can bring together demand and sort of maybe sort of strike a kind of some sort of collective agreement to secure deals. But what would you need to make that happen? Olivier, what do you think? What would you need to deliver that sort of aggregated demand?
So you are seeing in Europe now competition between Hamburg, Amsterdam, Groningen, Rotterdam, because they are realizing that over the next 20 years, all of these massive diesel tanks they used to have to import diesel are going to be disused, and they need to get market share. So I am seeing a lot of esports really going very, very hard to be these places. Also, leveraging on existing industrial clusters is the lowest hanging fruit you can have, right? So you're seeing Teesside. I mean, look at Stanlow. I mean, I worked as an engineer in Stanlow 20 years ago, and to see this thing is still going is quite amazing, and for the right reasons. So it's all about clarity of the rules and making sure that they are also very easy to understand. What was the quote-unquote genius of the IRA, right? The IRA was extremely clear. It's just like the only thing that counts is the end content, carbon content of that molecule. Everything else is bullshit, right? And that's good, clarity. And they only did this because they realized that I have industrial clusters in Texas and Louisiana and West Virginia, which in 20 years' time, what's going to happen to this workforce? So they are leveraging these existing places, putting a lot of money, but also, let's be very honest, Europe saw that as a threat. They say, oh, like, you know, what are they going to be dumping cheap ammonia or hydrogen to us? What's going to happen to our domestic industry? And from the US point of view, they're saying, wait a minute, US taxpayer is paying for you to have subsidized hydrogen, for you to make it easy. So do your part, enable these clusters, you know, work hard on these clusters. And I think a lot of people are still trying to figure out, and again, in a Brussels way, there's been a lot of over-regulation, which is being stripped back. And the UK way, this is the country that created CFDs, that created the offshore wind industry. What the hell are we doing? Right? We can do so much better. So it's, you know, do I have an answer? Of course I don't, right? Otherwise I would be, you know, a gazillionaire. But it's for me, it's very clear. Simplicity is everything, is all that we need, because it's already complex enough.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting point you brought up about, I suppose, you know, that question about who exports, right? And I think, you know, with the US and IRA, as you said, there's so much investment going on there. Everyone I speak to says, you know, essentially that is the clear focus because of that clarity. But I think I wonder, you know, maybe if I could just bring out some ideas from you about where you think supplies might be a first stop from, you know, into the EU. Is it North Africa? Is it the Middle East? Is it the US? Steffan, I'm going to start with you. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. I think Olivier and Ro probably have a better handle on, you know, contracts that go across their desk and things like that. But people I've spoken to and things I've seen recently, I was at an event recently with some representatives from Chile. So I know Chile are very keen to produce and to export. They're a country, I can't remember the number now, but they can generate as much renewable energy as anybody, so the ability to produce green hydrogen and export that is huge, and they've got a comparatively small, I think 20 million population, comparatively small population, so I think they're very keen to do something there. At Innovate we've worked quite a lot with counterparts in Canada, so Canada seem very keen on the production side. They've got a bigger population, so they'll use more of it, but I think they're keen to export too. I guess there's a decision for the EU and the UK as to the standard of hydrogen we receive, because I think it's likely that Canadian hydrogen is more likely to be blue, perhaps CCUS enabled. On my radar, I suppose other things, Australia, again, talk about that renewable energy generation, you know, they've vast land area, and also they've, for as long as anyone can remember, Australia have been exporting energy, you know, coal and what have you. So yeah, I think there's a few to start us off.
Ro, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's another good question that doesn't have a real answer to it. You know, I think we're seeing parts of the Middle East be perhaps more advanced than other places. Olivier mentioned NEOM that reached its financial close the other week. And once you start producing, you start producing. And the EU currently looks to be the biggest market for these types of products. So if you're the first one to develop these projects, you'll probably be the likely one to send them there. You know, other areas of interest, you mentioned Namibia, Egypt is another big country that's trying to go at this hard. Morocco, places in South America. There's sort of a lot of interests in these projects. I think when you start putting on, though, your traditional project finance lawyer's glasses on and looking at some of these jurisdictions, then you start to see interesting challenges. Once you put aside your off-take contract, and once you put to another side your technical challenges, you start saying, well, wait a minute. What are the country risks of Egypt in producing this sort of green hydrogen derivatives? Right? It's a country that's very hungry for energy. It has tremendous demand for it. It's using a lot of gas and fuel oil and other, less clean energies to produce that energy. Why are they going to develop all of this new capacity and then export it all? And sometimes I think that some of the countries that are looking at these projects, that are looking at hosting them, are doing that with the perhaps naive expectations that the returns are going to be similar to the returns you might see in hydrocarbon projects in your country. But they're not, right? I mean, they're going to be much thinner. And so your incentive to continue allowing that export, if there's a challenge in your own country, becomes greater. And, how do you evaluate that political risk is something that we haven't come to yet, because we're still grappling with earlier phases of the project. But I think that's going to become more and more an issue and a concern that we see in this sector.
Yeah, I think Egypt is a really interesting one. I think so. Olivier mentioned about the potential for food riots, and I think Egypt, with its bread riots in the 70s and others, obviously would be quite highly listed in terms of that sort of political risk. Olivier, what do you think in terms of exports? High hopes for the first hydrogen from Paraguay?
So I think as we heard, price is price is price. And the only way to produce hydrogen very cheaply is if you have baseload power 24/7 going. So you can use established electrolyzer technology. Like electrolyzers have been running for more than 80 years today, right? So this is not new, right? PEM is a bit newer, but this is not new. So for us, it was all about how can you leverage existing infrastructure, existing power supply, existing port facilities to be able to be one of the first to market, because then it means your capex is very low. And if you are using excess hydropower, obviously you will have some of the lowest long-term low-cost electricity available. And that puts you in a very strong advantage. Now you have to compete head-on. I mean, you talked earlier about which one will be first. Arguably, I think the first zero-carbon ammonia will come from the US with blue ammonia. But I would consider it as a transition fuel until we have the green, right? The blue gives you the scale, but the end goal is the green. So the Paraguay is one, Costa Rica is the other 100% green grid, 99.5% green grid country. Colombia has a lot of potential. Politics are very complicated, so this is where we go back to country risk. You cannot finance a project without country risk. Brazil, massive potential. They're pushing very hard. Lula government, which is a little bit still uncertain, but going into the right direction. However, price. We live in an environment where interest rates have doubled in the past year, where wind and solar project capex has increased by 25% after going down 10% every single year for 10 years. So we have to, manage these things. So leveraging existing resources will get you faster to market. That's our belief, but we are leveraging existing resources into an existing market, which is the fertilizer market. So it's a real challenge, but again, we need to walk before we can run. So I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. Well, listen, chaps, thanks very much. Steffan, Ro, Olivier, thanks for bearing with us and competing against lunchtime. But now I'm going to let you go and you can get your own lunch. Thanks you so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much.